Think about this. Why do all major religions share the same patterns? Why are doubters branded as heretics? Why does faith demand surrender, not questions? Today you will learn how religious teachings rewire your brain to fear independent thought and how to break free from that invisible cage. Religious institutions collect over $945 billion globally each year, yet studies suggest that approximately $62 billion of that is lost to fraud and embezzlement. But there's a more insidious currency being exchanged: your spiritual autonomy. Through prosperity gospel teachings, miracle offerings, and seed faith doctrines, religious organizations have perfected the art of monetizing spiritual manipulation. Behind these transactions lies a deeper pattern, one where submission is traded for salvation, where questioning is labeled as rebellion, and where your natural divinity is reframed as sinfulness requiring redemption. This video exposes the psychological and emotional tactics religious institutions employ to maintain control, from fear-based teachings to the suppression of knowledge that would empower individuals to recognize their inherent sovereignty. What if the most powerful prison ever built has no walls, no bars, and no guards? A prison constructed entirely of belief, where the locks exist only in your mind, yet hold more firmly than steel. This is the invisible architecture that religious systems have perfected over millennia, a structure that requires no maintenance because its inhabitants willingly remain inside, convinced their captivity is salvation. The blueprint for this architecture begins in childhood, when the mind remains open and impressionable. Religious programming takes root in these fertile years, planting seeds of identity that will flower into unquestioning devotion. The child learns not through reason, but through repetition. The prayers before bedtime, the stories of divine punishment, the rituals performed without understanding. Each becomes a neural pathway, a groove in consciousness that deepens with each passing year. At the foundation of this architecture lies a singular, devastating premise: that you were born unworthy. The concept of original sin functions as what might be called an energetic contract, binding you to an inheritance of shame before you've taken your first conscious breath. This isn't merely a theological position. It's a psychological imprint that reshapes your relationship with existence itself. You emerge into the world not as a sovereign being, but as a broken vessel requiring redemption from forces outside yourself. The architecture expands through the carefully calculated use of fear. When a child is taught that invisible eyes track their every thought, that eternal torture awaits those who question, something profound happens within the brain. The amygdala, your threat detection system, becomes hypersensitive to anything that challenges religious authority. This isn't metaphorical, it's neurological. Research reveals that fear-based religious teachings create physical changes in brain structure, particularly in areas related to critical thinking. The body reacts to theological doubt with the same biochemical alarm signals it uses for physical danger. Think of what happens when you begin to question your faith: the racing heart, the tightening chest, the inexplicable dread. These aren't spiritual phenomena. They're the physiological symptoms of a brain that has been conditioned to perceive independent thought as a threat to survival. Your body literally revolts against your mind's attempt to break free. This architecture of control manifests in what experts now recognize as religious trauma syndrome. The symptoms permeate nearly every area of a person's life: anxiety, depression, panic attacks, intrusive thoughts. The physical manifestations include headaches, fatigue, muscle tension, and gastrointestinal issues. Your very cells hold the memory of theological terror. What makes this system of control so insidious is how it positions itself between you and the transcendent. The natural human drive for sovereignty, for direct connection with whatever lies beyond, becomes labeled as heresy, as arrogance, as the original sin that cast humanity from paradise. The desire to know, to experience the divine directly, is reframed as the forbidden fruit. And so you learn to distrust your deepest intuition, to fear your most profound questions. Religious institutions understand that their survival depends on this architecture remaining intact. They position themselves as exclusive intermediaries between humans and the divine, creating a psychological trap that discourages followers from seeking answers elsewhere. The message is clear. Salvation exists only within these walls. To leave is to be lost. The most sophisticated aspect of this control system is how it creates a paradox within the seeker. Your authentic spiritual impulse, the genuine yearning for transcendence, becomes weaponized against you. The more intensely you seek God, truth, or enlightenment, the more dependent you become on the very systems that prevent direct experience. Your spiritual hunger feeds the machine designed to keep you starving. The brain's threat detection system becomes the perfect enforcer. By instilling fear, religions ensure compliance more effectively than any external authority could achieve. Followers become less likely to question religious doctrine when that questioning feels physically dangerous. The fear of sin, hell, or divine retribution becomes a constant companion, keeping you small and loyal. Fear controls behavior more effectively than logic ever could. This is how the architecture of belief makes questioning feel physically dangerous. By creating neural networks that process theological doubt as survival threat. The body becomes a prison guard, releasing stress hormones at the first sign of independent thinking. The mind becomes both prisoner and warden, monitoring its own thoughts for signs of rebellion against the divine order. But fear is only the foundation of this elaborate structure. The true masterpiece of control is built through something much more insidious. While fear might initiate the relationship between believer and institution, it's not what sustains it. For that, something far more powerful is required, a psychological alchemy that transforms the human need for connection into a currency that can only be spent within the walls of the church, the temple, the mosque. A transformation that turns your natural sovereignty into a desperate need for salvation that only they can provide. Your entire spiritual journey has been shaped by an invisible exchange, one where your sovereignty was traded for salvation, a quiet bargain made without your conscious awareness. While you sought transcendence, what was truly taking place was a subtle transaction, one where your natural connection to the divine was transformed into a commodity that could only be purchased through obedience. Religious institutions have perfected a sophisticated form of psychological alchemy, converting the raw material of human seeking into the gold of perpetual dependency. This process mirrors addiction patterns with unsettling precision. The initial promise, connection to something greater, creates a momentary euphoria, but that connection is never fully delivered, only partially revealed, ensuring you return again and again to the source that promises fulfillment, while systematically withholding it. At the heart of this alchemy lies a powerful claim. These institutions position themselves as the exclusive intermediaries between humans and the divine. The message, delivered through centuries of doctrine, is unambiguous. You cannot reach God, enlightenment, or salvation on your own. The path requires authorized guides, specific rituals, approved texts. Your direct experience becomes secondary to institutional interpretation. Your intuition becomes subordinate to dogma. This manufactured dependency reveals itself through the constant seeking of external validation. The believer becomes trapped in an endless cycle of striving for approval, from religious leaders, from the community, from a God whose voice is interpreted by those same authorities. The bar for worthiness always moves higher, just beyond reach. The fear of rejection becomes a weight carried into every thought, every prayer, every action. Individuals begin to overcommit to religious activities or suppress parts of themselves to avoid this rejection, leading to a loss of personal autonomy. Here's the most chilling part. Watch how this dependency is maintained through the alchemy of guilt. Religious institutions have mastered manufactured guilt cycles, creating impossible standards that ensure spiritual failure, followed by conditional forgiveness that must be continuously earned. This cycle transforms natural human imperfection into a currency of shame, payable only through increased devotion to the institution itself. Your worthiness becomes contingent on external judgment rather than inherent value. In religious settings, this dependency often manifests as what psychologists call the fawning response, a trauma reaction where individuals become hyper-attuned to the expectations of authority figures. They overaccommodate religious expectations, going above and beyond to impress leaders or appear righteous, often suppressing personal beliefs or questions. This behavior stems not from authentic devotion, but from fear of judgment, punishment, or being seen as sinful or unworthy. The believer becomes a perfect reflection of institutional expectations, while their authentic self recedes further into shadow. The alchemy of dependency reaches its most transparent form in prosperity gospel teachings. Here, the spiritual and material become explicitly intertwined. Believers are taught that their financial contributions directly correlate to divine favor. This doctrine emphasizes the believer's ability to transcend poverty or illness through devotion and positive confession, with donations to select Christian ministries seen as a means to increase one's material wealth and health. The exchange becomes nakedly transactional, your money for God's blessing, mediated by the institution that profits regardless of outcome. Let that sink in. Now here's where it gets interesting. Consider the phenomenon of miracle offering seasons that typically run from October through December. These carefully orchestrated campaigns capitalize on end-of-year giving and exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of believers. Churches use this season to encourage sacrificial giving, often pressuring members to give beyond their means, with the implication that their faith and blessings are tied to their financial contributions. The offerings are promoted with manipulative language, such as promises of miracles, and are often tied to the prosperity gospel, where giving is linked to receiving blessings, often in financial forms. When questions arise about this system, another alchemical process begins: spiritual bypassing. This tactic encourages individuals to use spiritual practices to avoid dealing with difficult emotions or unresolved issues. Doubts are reframed as lack of faith. Critical thinking becomes spiritual weakness. Legitimate concerns are dismissed through a focus on positive thinking or spiritual experiences to avoid confronting painful memories or deeply ingrained beliefs. The result is a superficial understanding of faith and a failure to address the root causes of emotional distress. This isn't just information, it's revelation. Through these alchemical processes, religious institutions transform what should be the most liberated aspect of human experience, spiritual connection, into the most controlled. They convert the natural human yearning for meaning into a dependence on external authority. They transmute your inherent divinity into a sense of perpetual unworthiness that only they can temporarily relieve. But maintaining this level of control requires more than psychological manipulation. It demands the suppression of anything that might awaken the sleeping sovereign within. Throughout history, certain knowledge has been systematically hidden, not because it was false, but because it contained truths too dangerous for those who profit from your spiritual dependency. Throughout history, certain texts have been systematically hidden, destroyed, or altered, not because they were false, but because they were too true. The pages that held humanity's most profound spiritual insights weren't burned for their heresy, but for their power to liberate. What threatens a system of control more than knowledge that renders the controller obsolete? Religious institutions have always understood a fundamental truth. Whoever controls access to the divine controls the masses. This isn't speculation. It's written in ash and absence, in the calculated destruction of sacred knowledge across centuries. The pattern reveals itself when you look closely at what was erased, and more importantly, why it was erased. Consider the Library of Alexandria, that ancient temple of wisdom where countless scrolls contain the spiritual and philosophical heritage of multiple civilizations. Its destruction wasn't merely a cultural tragedy. It was a deliberate act of spiritual suppression. Religious zealots played a significant role in its destruction, removing access to philosophical, scientific, and spiritual works, thereby limiting the potential for independent thought and spiritual exploration. This wasn't random destruction. It was calculated elimination of alternative perspectives to maintain the dominance of a particular worldview. The pattern becomes unmistakable when we examine the systematic burial of the Gnostic Gospels, which remained hidden for over 1,600 years. Why would these particular texts require such thorough suppression? Because they taught something revolutionary, that divine knowledge comes from within, not from external authorities. These Gospels emphasized that divine knowledge, gnosis, comes from within, not from external institutions, directly contradicting the claims of religious authorities who position themselves as the sole intermediaries between humans and the divine. The elimination of these texts wasn't about preserving truth. It was about maintaining the Church's monopoly on spiritual knowledge and authority, ensuring that individuals remain dependent on the institution for access to spiritual truths. When you control access to God, you control everything. The Council of Nicaea stands as another testament to this pattern of suppression. This gathering wasn't merely about standardizing Christian doctrine, it was about centralizing religious authority and establishing standardized doctrines and practices that further consolidated power within the institutional church. By defining orthodoxy and labeling alternative teachings as heretical, the Council created the framework for controlling the spiritual narrative for centuries to come. What's most revealing is which teachings were consistently deemed most dangerous. Ancient wisdom traditions like Gnosticism and Hermeticism weren't condemned for being false. They were condemned for offering alternative spiritual frameworks that empowered individuals to seek divine connection without the need for intermediaries. These traditions recognized the divine spark within each person, a recognition that would render priestly classes and religious hierarchies unnecessary. This pattern of suppression continues in more subtle forms today. Modern religious institutions often discourage comparative religion studies and critical examination of sacred texts, perpetuating ignorance and maintaining control over followers. By limiting access to diverse perspectives and discouraging critical analysis, these institutions ensure their doctrines remain unchallenged and unquestioned, a perfect strategy for maintaining psychological control. The common thread connecting all suppressed teachings across time and cultures isn't their falsity, but their empowering truth. The revolutionary recognition that divinity exists within each person. This isn't merely a theological position. It's the ultimate threat to religious authority. If the divine dwells within you, what need have you for intermediaries? If wisdom speaks in your own heart, why pay for another's interpretation? This is why certain ancient spiritual texts remain systematically hidden from mainstream religious followers. Not because they might mislead you away from truth, but because they might lead you directly to it, bypassing the institutions that have positioned themselves as the gatekeepers of divine wisdom. The texts that were burned, buried, or banned share one dangerous revelation: that the kingdom of heaven is within you. That divine connection requires no permission, no intermediary, no institution. That you are, and have always been, worthy of direct communion with the sacred. This knowledge doesn't destroy faith. It transforms it from dependency to sovereignty. Yet, despite centuries of suppression, something within the human spirit refuses to remain dormant forever. The very act of crushing these truths seems to scatter their seeds more widely. The same impulse that drove ancient seekers to record these dangerous insights continues to stir in the hearts of those who sense there's more to spiritual life than what institutions offer. The flame may dim, but it never truly extinguishes. What emerges is a profound realization. The awakening of spiritual sovereignty isn't rebellion against the divine, but its fulfillment. The questions that arise within you aren't signs of faithlessness, but the stirring of a deeper faith, one that transcends dogma and reaches for direct experience. The first moment of awakening doesn't arrive with thunder and lightning. It begins as a quiet, persistent question that refuses to be silenced, a whisper that grows louder with each passing day until it drowns out the familiar hymns and practiced prayers. The question takes many forms, but its essence remains the same. What if everything I've been taught is designed not to reveal truth, but to conceal it? Despite the sophisticated systems of control we've explored, an innate drive towards spiritual sovereignty eventually stirs within the human heart. This awakening isn't orchestrated by external forces. It emerges from the depths of your being, a remembering rather than a learning. The spark of divinity that religious institutions have worked so diligently to dim suddenly finds oxygen, and with it, the courage to burn brighter. But this awakening brings both liberation and confrontation. As consciousness expands, you must face the painful reality of your internalized programming. Every question triggers not just intellectual curiosity, but existential terror. This is where many seekers encounter what psychologists identify as the freeze response, a trauma reaction that manifests as emotional paralysis when confronting religious doctrine. This freeze response isn't weakness. It's evidence of how deeply the programming has embedded itself within your nervous system. In this state, you may feel trapped within harmful religious settings, unable to make decisions or take action due to overwhelming fear. The body remembers what the mind questions, creating a battle between emerging awareness and conditioned response. You stand immobilized between worlds, no longer able to embrace the old beliefs, yet too frightened to step fully into the new. This paralysis often accompanies what Friedrich Nietzsche captured in his declaration that God is dead. Contrary to popular misinterpretation, this wasn't a triumphant atheistic claim, but a somber recognition of the collapse of external meaning systems. When the God-centered framework that provided structure to your existence falls away, you face what Nietzsche called the abyss, a void where meaning itself seems to dissolve. This collapse isn't merely theological, It's existential. The certainty that once informed every decision, every moral judgment, every moment of suffering and joy suddenly evaporates. You stand alone in a universe that no longer comes with an instruction manual. This is the desert that every awakening sovereign must cross, the space between programmed meaning and self-created purpose. Yet research reveals something extraordinary about this painful journey: the potential for post-traumatic growth following religious deconstruction. The very trauma that once threatened to destroy you becomes the foundation for unprecedented expansion. Like a bone that grows stronger at the point of fracture, the psyche rebuilds itself with greater resilience and wisdom after religious trauma. This rebuilding follows recognizable stages. First comes the critical examination of harmful doctrines, then the grief for lost certainty, followed by anger at the deception, and finally, the courageous reconstruction of a personal spirituality based on direct experience rather than imposed dogma. The journey isn't linear. It spirals back on itself, revisiting old wounds as they surface for healing. Practical steps emerge for those reclaiming their sovereignty. Setting boundaries becomes essential. Learning to say no to religious guilt, manipulation, and the expectations of communities that demand conformity over authenticity. Self-validation replaces external approval as you learn to trust your own experiences and intuition. Most critically, you begin the sacred work of reconnecting with your inner wisdom, that quiet voice that religious institutions taught you to ignore or fear. Ancient wisdom traditions offer alternative paths for this reconnection. Unlike dogmatic religions, these frameworks don't ask you to believe, they ask you to experience. They teach that God is not a figure on a throne, but a frequency, a pattern, a spark inside your DNA. These traditions encourage practices like meditation, mindfulness, and self-reflection to cultivate inner awareness and establish direct spiritual connection without intermediaries. This is how you rebuild trust and reconnect with authentic spirituality after religious trauma, through recognizing that awakening isn't rebellion against the divine, but the fulfillment of your soul's deepest purpose. The journey doesn't end with deconstruction. It begins there. As you shed the layers of programming, you discover that what emerges isn't emptiness, but fullness, not disconnection, but true communion. The healing from religious trauma is a journey, but it's possible and can lead to reclaiming one's life and moving forward in freedom. This freedom isn't the abandonment of spirituality, but its reclamation on your terms, guided by your experience, answerable to your truth. What awaits beyond the programming isn't spiritual death, but spiritual birth, an awakening to the divinity that has always resided within you. The sovereignty you claim isn't stolen, but reclaimed, a return to your original nature rather than a departure from it. This journey from programming to sovereignty reveals the most profound truth of all, that what religious institutions labeled as the forbidden fruit, direct knowing of good and evil, of the divine nature within yourself, was never the fall from grace, but the path to it. The most revolutionary truth isn't that you've been manipulated. It's that you were never broken in the first place. Your sovereignty wasn't lost. It was merely forgotten. The wings you were born with still exist, even after years of crawling. The path forward isn't found in new dogma or external validation, but in the quiet recognition that the kingdom of heaven has always been within you. As that banned Gospel of Thomas revealed, split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift a stone, and you will find me. Your awakening isn't just personal, it's part of a collective remembering that transforms consciousness itself. This is why those identifying as spiritual but not religious continue to grow in number. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Now I ask you, what truth have you remembered? Drop it in the comments. Your voice may be the spark that wakes another soul.